We're live. Dr. Helen McCarthy, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Jonno. It's lovely to be with you.
I did read that you have a PhD from Oxford, which where we come from is pretty much like the highest standard of any education you can get in the world. I hope you appreciate the pun here when I say I'm talking to a real heavyweight.
Thank you.
But you did. So you were in clinical practice for years, and then you became the appetite doctor, which is the context in which we are speaking today. Could you tell me how you went from clinical psychology into appetite retraining?
Sure. Yeah, certainly. Well, I began my PhD, which was from, as I said, as you were saying, from Oxford, was actually in the psychology of eating disorders. And that was one of the groups of people that I'd worked with throughout my clinical practice. It's not the main one because I've mainly worked in private practice for some time. But I do work with, I have worked with people with eating disorders. And at the point that I started to get interested in appetite, it was down to a chance remark by a patient that I was seeing who'd actually suffered from bulimia nervosa. And this patient was 40 years old, and she had suffered with bulimia in her 20s, and then she had been, she'd recovered and she'd been absolutely fine since. But I was seeing her, she was referred by her doctor because she had had a recurrence of the bulimia after she'd followed a very low calorie meal replacement plan. And that, unfortunately, that wouldn't trigger eating disorders in everybody, but unfortunately with her vulnerability, she found herself in a bulimic pattern again. So she came for help with that, and we used standard, actually it was cognitive behavioural therapy for eating disorders, and she made a really good recovery. And as she left the final session of this course of therapy, literally on her way out of the door, she said, thank you. And she said, I just wish I could lose a stone in weight. And she went. And I was completely stunned to realize that thanks to my experience, my degree, I've got 3 degrees in psychology. I've worked, at that point, I'd been working as a clinical psychologist for over 20 years.
Wow.
And thanks to all of that, I knew how to help her overcome a serious eating disorder, but I had no idea how to help her just lose a moderate amount of weight. And that seemed to be just crazy. It seemed to be completely absurd. Not least, I was confident that I didn't know how to help her, not least because I was about 1.5 stone over what I wanted to be, and had been since the birth of my first child, which was about 15 years before. So I was then really fired up to see whether all that psychology training, post-qualification training, expertise, everything I'd done could possibly be up to the job of helping people lose just a moderate amount of weight in an everyday way, not to do with treating any sort of eating disorder. So that was the start, thanks to Megan. It's not her real name.
Right. Can I ask a question at this point, which is, I mean, as a psychologist, you would be excused for not being able to help people lose weight, because that's not typically the place where people would go.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And what I now think is that actually, for many people, a psychologist, or at least a psychological way of thinking, is perhaps one of the first things that might be worth thinking about. Because what I came to realize very quickly was that my 1.5 stone, which I had actually lost, I have to mention, I had lost because I'd gone to Weight Watchers, but I put it on 6 months later because I could not stick to counting points and things, even though it's not to knock Weight Watchers because it was successful. It was only temporarily successful.
Yeah.
So I'd not really bothered since I'd tried that. I just sort of got on with things. But what I realized was that was a number of things, but one key one was that I was not eating in tune with what my body was saying. I realized I was eating too much, basically, and a key thing for me was that I knew, thanks to Weight Watchers and thanks to what I'm like generally, I knew this was only going to work if I didn't have to give up my favourite foods. And my favourite foods included, it's interesting how they've changed over time, but at the time they definitely included cheese, red wine, chocolate, ice cream, those sorts of things. Those were among the things that I thought, this is only going to work if I don't have to give those things up. So it's not rocket science to realize that if you're going to lose weight and you're still going to eat all of the same foods, the thing that needs to change is the quantity.
Yeah.
And maybe the balance. That's another thing. Things have evolved. So now my favorite foods still include those things, probably, but I've discovered things that I never imagined I would absolutely love, which are vegetables. I mean, that's the thing that I really tend to crave now, which is bizarre. Yeah. Compared with how I used to be. But anyway, that's just me. That doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. But the thing is that the realization that went along realizing that the problem had been that I was eating too much, which was really simple, yes, was that I had never really for decades allowed myself to get hungry. That was, I started to realize that actually every mealtime, I was approaching a mealtime, I might be slightly hungry, but that was almost fluke, chance.
Okay. And so then you had to learn, like you had to kind of develop a relationship with your appetite, essentially.
Exactly. That's why I came to call it Appetite Retraining, because the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the way that I was eating out of tune with my appetite, so I would eat what was on my plate rather than stop when I was full. I'd eat something because it was really tempting and I fancied it and I liked it, and so on and so on. And so as I listened more and tuned in, I started thinking about, I'd studied biology as part of my psychology degree, and I've always been really interested in it. And so it started to make a lot of sense to think about how we evolved to eat, and how actually as infants we do eat like that. We do largely, if you try and feed a baby, as I have done before, you try and feed a baby more than they want, they will not have it. Once they've got to the end of what they are interested in, they clamp their mouths shut, they turn away. The food can end up anywhere, but not in their mouths if they don't want it. And so I was curious as to how, a number of decades later, and I know that lots and lots of other people are like this, you don't stop eating when you've had just enough. You stop eating for all sorts of other reasons.
Yeah, when you are in pain.
yeah, possibly. Yeah, when it's really gone too far, or when other people eating with you have finished, maybe because you're switched into social niceties, or a lot of us finish what's on our plate because it's there, and because we're raised by people who've known food shortages, and therefore we have had it instilled into us that it's bad to waste food. Well, I absolutely agree it's bad to waste food, but in my view now, what I came to, another thing that really struck me was that when I was eating past the point of being full, I was wasting the food anyway. It was just going through my body and I was accumulating fat.
That's interesting, actually. That I've never heard that before. And that's profound, because people say I don't want to waste, but it is a waste. You're right.
It is a waste. It is a waste. And it's particularly wasteful because we don't stop and realize we're doing that. We do it day in, day out. And it therefore is extra wasted food pretty regularly for those of us who ate like that. I mean, I don't eat like that anymore. And the reason I think I waste far less now is that actually I know how much to buy or how much to order in a restaurant. Or, I mean, seriously, in a restaurant yesterday, the waitress came and said, "Do you want to order another dish? Because I'm worried that's not going to be too much." And I said, "That's not going to be enough." And I said, "No, I think it's going to be too much." And I was right, it was. So strange things happen when you start to listen to how much your body actually needs.
And so what is the method that you recommend for someone learning to understand their appetite? How do you go about doing that?
Well, the starting point is a very simple biological fact that human beings have evolved in a way that means that we suit meals with gaps in between. A lot of us graze continuously, and that doesn't really suit our evolved biology, nor does enormous meals, because we tend to eat by the clock anyway. If we're that's a very powerful trigger for eating. So the first thing is to think of meals with gaps. It doesn't have to be 3. Most people seem to go for 3 meals a day, but it could be 2 meals a day. It could be 4 meals a day, with gaps in between long enough for you to digest the food. And what that means is maybe starting to listen to what your body is telling you about whether you feel hungry, and whether when your body is telling you you've eaten just enough. And that is a subjective thing. It can only be a subjective thing. But if you learn to stop eating when you've had just enough, when you're just full, and you space your meals out, and it involves a bit of trial and error, but basically you eat what you want, whatever sort of eating regime suits you. And it could be anything, because I'm not a dietitian, I'm not a nutritionist, that's not my expertise. So that isn't a part of what I talk about. It's more how you eat. But So whatever you want to eat, whatever suits you, if you weigh more than you want to, then stopping sooner and allowing yourself to get definitely hungry by the next meal means that you will be allowing your body to metabolize some of the fats.
Sure. But you're also just being natural. Like in the wild, you wouldn't look for food unless you were hungry.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. So you did say that we're biologically designed or suited to long gaps between meals.
Gaps.
Is there specific biology that you're referring to there?
Well, if you think about the size of the human stomach, it's a pouch which is roughly the size of a fist. Right. It's muscular. It expands as food enters it, so it's got a capacity to accept a large amount. And then the food that is in the stomach is then obviously digested and processed by the gut. And when if there's quite a lot to say about this, but put very simply, as you're eating and as your stomach is filling with food, the stretch receptors in the wall of the stomach are sending signals that they are stretching. They're telling your brain that the stomach is receiving food. So you can use that. You can use those changing sensations, and this is what I encourage people to think about doing, is notice mouthful by mouthful how your stomach or gut or whatever is feeling, so that you notice going from feeling definitely hungry to not so much, to neutral, to actually quite full, actually with not necessarily a huge amount of food. The amount will depend on your metabolic rate, it'll depend on how active you are, it'll depend on your age, it'll depend on a number of things.
Right. Okay, so you're saying that basically, like a lion, for instance, is designed to eat an enormous meal, like once every 3 or 4 days, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, yes, I don't know about lions actually, but I was thinking more of something that does eat a lot and then has a longer gap. Might be a snake, which might eat a large mammal and then spend days digesting it. We're not like that. We're just not built like that. We've got the capacity to overeat massively. Like if you think about a sort of celebratory meal, like a Christmas dinner, for example, we can eat, the equivalent maybe volume of a small mammal. But the problem is that we then are we're then very, very likely to eat at our next mealtime, whereas the snake isn't on that sort of system. The snake isn't thinking, oh, it's breakfast. The snake won't be seeking...
Has a food hangover for like a month.
Probably, yeah. Whereas we're a bit more inclined to eat again soon.
Okay, so basically the first step is to sort of cut out snacks, and sort of stop foraging in between meals, so you can actually experience what your hunger actually feels like.
That's right. That's right. You might go for you might have a small snack if your lifestyle, the starting point really is what your lifestyle means in terms of when your meals need to be. So you start with that basis, and then if, for example, if you have to have breakfast early and you don't get to eat lunch until relatively late, you might need a mid-morning snack, but you can work out what that would be and how much it would need to be to keep you going till lunchtime. You can. So snacking isn't out altogether, but it's definitely not just grazing mindlessly would be the thing to totally try and rule out, because you don't tend to get much pleasure from that.
Yeah, and then you said I think it was the 1/4 rule, or remove a quarter at a time, was one of the rules.
Yeah, that's just my sort of rule of thumb, is that when people are trying to get used to eating less, and if you are somebody who has this is usually relevant to people's evening meals, in my experience. People usually identify one of the things that is keeping their weight higher than they want it to be as eating a large meal in the evening. And so, and they don't want to, people generally don't want to miss out. They don't want to lose pleasure from what they're eating, which I completely agree with. I think that food is potentially a source of enormous joy and pleasure, and we should keep it so. But if you think about, if your evening meal, let's say, is pretty large, or larger than you need, then a way of thinking about how to cut it down is just to remove a quarter of it, just for a few days until you get used to this. Serve it as normal and remove a quarter and throw that quarter away, or put it in the fridge if you know you're going to be able to leave it and eat it for a planned meal at another time, or a snack. So a quarter is substantial enough to make a difference, but it doesn't freak people out like halving a meal size does, because halving is big, right? Halving is a lot, too much for most of us. But that's just a practical tip for how you might go about that. And what I suggest to people is, because you're trying to get used to just adjusting how much you eat, it doesn't matter which quarter you take off, frankly. You can, if you're worried about losing out on pleasure, remove the quarter that is the bit you don't like so much. You might think, well, it'll be the vegetables then, and that's supposed to be the healthy bit. But for now, if what you're trying to do is get used to eating less, you can go with that argument and keep them in, or you could just think, well, this is about temporarily doing something different so that I permanently retrain my expectation of amount.
Okay. So, I would obviously vote for removing the carb, but most people would say that the carb is like the delicious thing.
Well, it's so interesting that you say that, because I think I was a really carby person. And the thing that I discovered, to my absolute astonishment, was the thing that I liked less, by and large, was the rice or the potatoes or the obviously it's pasta with everything mixed in. It doesn't make sense to say pasta, but it's not necessarily what you expect to happen to your tastes and preferences. But it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter whether you remove the carbs or something else to start with. But as I say, it needs to fit in with your lifestyle and the foods that suit you. So you can do this approach with whatever intolerances or allergies that you've got, whatever food practices you follow for religious or any other reasons.
Got it. And there's a specific reason for removing it rather than just serving less?
No, serving less is better. But
right.
But if you can just do the serving less to start with, then you're less likely to be wasting the food, because it's more likely to be usable. And if you can cook less, it's a sort of sequentially working back to cooking less and buying less. So you actually potentially save money doing this. No, you're absolutely right. It's better to put out less in the first place, if you can gauge the amount. But where people are really slightly stumped by that, the suggestion, I make that suggestion of, well, just do what you normally do and then remove a quarter just as a stepping stone.
Yeah, I would have thought, I thought that there was some kind of ritual there, like a practice, like, because I think there was a guy who was on our program about 7 years ago, Brian Berkman. He lost 88 kilograms. Mm-hmm. And he said one of the things that he was taught to do, but it sounds like a similar type program to what you're suggesting. They said that you should learn to leave like a big portion of your plate behind, which I mean is obviously tougher because you know it's like there.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think that the principle there is similar to mine, but I would suggest that it's useful to go through that process in order to get to the point of knowing how much how much food you need to keep going till the next mealtime, and as a sort of almost a warning to the middle-aged, sedentary people amongst you. You might find, as I did, that the amount of food you need is much less, shockingly less than you might have got used to. Because this is one of the things that I realized, is that we've got conditioned or sort of persuaded to think of meals in terms of particular sizes, and a typical restaurant food serving of a main course is about 3 times what I need for an entire meal. Wow. So but I mean, if you were active, training, younger, you might need that as your whole meal. But whatever age, metabolic rate, and activity levels you are, you'll serve the same portion. Wow.
So let's talk about stopping eating when you're full. I go all out. Like almost every meal, I don't stop until I wouldn't say it's Christmas fullness, but close. Yeah. And I just like, I don't know how to turn it off. So I'm interested in this technique. Like what? Tell us the secret.
Well, I think the main thing for me is that, and this will only apply, this might or might not apply to you, Jonno, right? That if you stop eating at the point that allows you to get hungry by the next meal, that's my point really. So you might need to finish all that food because you might be ravenously hungry by the next meal, right? You're probably a lot more active than me. I suspect you're, younger with a higher metabolic rate and so on. So you might well be working on a different basis, but the key thing about allowing yourself to get hungry by the next meal, and this absolutely blew me away and still does, is that it is when you are actually hungry that your food tastes as good as it possibly can. It's like, that there's a saying that is attributed to the ancient Greeks, which is that hunger is the best seasoning. And I really, really understand that, because it's the same food when you're hungry compared with the same food when you're not is 2 different experiences. And so the thing that helps me to stop, if there's still food on my plate and I'm thinking, oh, why not keep going, is the benefit of stopping now is it's only by stopping now that I'll be hungry by my next meal. And that means that meal will seriously blow me away, right? It's amazing.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I'm just thinking about my children when you say that. I use that. I didn't know it was seasoning. I thought it was just the best recipe. Hunger is the best recipe, but it makes sense. Seasoning brings out the best.
Yeah, it might be different translations.
Yeah, and my children, so I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and the only thing we want them to do in the evening is eat, because then they sleep. And, and I know that when they have a big lunch, that they become very picky about dinner. Like you'll present them with dinner and they'll say, oh, no, I don't want to eat it. But if they've had like a tiny lunch, I can give them anything, something they've never had before. And they'll be like, they'll give me a little bit of, lip. And then they're like, and then they just say, okay, fine, whatever, I'll eat it. And so grown-ups aren't that different. That's very interesting.
But that's a lovely example, I think, isn't it? And that's a lovely example of why for you and for you, it might matter more that your children eat more in the evening and sleep than eat more at lunchtime.
Yeah.
And the sleep is obviously massively beneficial to them and to you, obviously, as a parent. That's going to really benefit you if they sleep.
Yeah. So you've also mentioned people getting to their goal weight and staying there, and this is like the holy grail of our entire industry. You know, we don't want you to yo-yo. So how do you recommend people get there?
The beauty of this approach is that because the focus is on changing your eating behaviors, your eating habits, one step at a time, by the time you get to your goal weight, your eating habits, your new eating habits are exactly that. They are habitual, and therefore it's easy to stay there. That's why this is so exciting, is that it still might take a little bit of thought, but it's not anything like the effort and focus that you need when you're losing weight. So this approach, what I would say is this appetite retraining takes effort and it takes focus, just like any weight loss diet does. This is not a diet. I would underline that in red 10 times. This is not a diet. It's about changing your eating habits from what they are now to being more in tune with your appetite, and you go one step at a time, and the weight loss follows the habit change, so that you can, what people sometimes find is there's a bit of a lag between I've reduced my evening meal by a quarter, so why isn't it showing up on the scales? Well, I don't understand that, and I've asked experts in the field why this happens, and I haven't yet found anyone who really understands that. So I'll keep asking, because it's a fascinating and important question. But basically, the focus is on behavior change, habit change.
Right. I mean, that's so. Do you know James Clear? He wrote Atomic Habits.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Yeah. He talks about the plateau of latent potential, which is like that. In fact, we reference part of that. We call it we reference something called the grief threshold, which is well. So anyway, the plateau of latent potential is that period where you're still building habits, but you haven't seen results yet.
Yeah.
And often we think that we're not gaining any ground. And what happens is actually, if we're just patient enough and those habits stack on top of each other and build momentum, then we get not only better results, but actually lasting results.
That's right.
So the grief threshold is just the concept of, the 5 stages of grief, bargaining, denial, rage, and all these things. So we say you shouldn't quit anything when you give stuff up. And this might be when you're taking on a new habit as well, like cutting out a quarter. It should never be so difficult that it drives you into stages of grief. So when you find yourself sitting there, bargaining with yourself or in denial, no, I'm sure I don't actually have a problem, then you've reached your grief threshold. So you turn it down.
Yeah. And that's a nice,
Sorry, and that's a nice.
Well, that's a nice point, because actually, the 3 key elements of appetite retraining are eating in tune with your appetite, and this is the second one: making eating habit changes manageable eating habit changes. And that's exactly your point, I think, is that we know a lot about behavior change. There's a huge literature on it. And one of the things that is probably a good idea for most of us most of the time is, if we're trying to change things that have become habitual, is that we do that 1 or maybe 2 habits at a time. So we're only doing what's manageable. It's still a challenge, but it's manageable. Whereas that is a contrast with a lot of diets which invite you to change the eating habits of a lifetime overnight. And I would suggest that is about as hard as you can get in terms of asking somebody to change. It's massive. It's absolutely massive.
Yeah, we used to tell people to quit. So we have these, in fact, I think I've got a copy of them somewhere, but we have these lists of like red listed foods, which are, like a traffic light, like green means go, orange means slow, and red means no. And in the past, we used to say, like, on day one, you just quit the whole thing. And it works. You know, if you cut out, and so the red list is like gluten, sugar, refined carbohydrates, processed food, breakfast cereal, like it's all everything between the fresh produce section and the cashier basically is on the red list. And so obviously the results are insane in the first couple of weeks, and people, I mean, the weight loss is dramatic, but it doesn't do anything for their habits. And obviously, you know, after 3 or 4 weeks, you know, people are in tremendous grief. They're grieving their past lives where they had pleasure. So I get it. What's the third thing? You said the first two.
Yeah, the third thing, thank you, is that when we make changes, when we go about changing things that we've that have become habitual, it is normal and healthy to encounter blocks, right? We have inbuilt resistance to change. It's part of our human psychology, is that we keep doing, thinking, and have the same feeling patterns that we've developed. It's what part of what makes us human. So when we go about trying to change something that's pretty established, it's not what we're built to do. So evolutionary psychology, which gets far less press than evolutionary biology, but it's the other side of the coin. If we think about how we are built, how our minds have evolved, is to keep doing the same thing. So as I developed this approach, initially what I did with Appetite Retraining was I did it on myself. I was basically my first guinea pig, and then I started doing it with people and then offering it to clients. And the more I did, the more in those early stages, in those early days, was the more people were telling me the same reasons that diets had failed them before. And so I just collected loads of these reasons and started trying to make sense of them. And it became clear to me that people were describing tended to be describing repeatedly one of 4 types of blocks. One was to do with lack of motivation. One was to do with willpower. One was to do with whether they actually believed they could do it or whether they deserved to do it. So sort of self-belief, self-esteem. And the 4th was to do with pressure from other people around eating. So I called those 4 things, motivation, willpower, self-belief, and pressure from others, saboteurs, sources of effectively self-sabotage. And I address those in the book that I've written, and it's something that is to be expected.
Totally. What do you recommend? So the self-belief thing is interesting, but I just want to touch back on the evolutionary psychology thing. This is sort of like a passion project. You said that we're designed to just continue doing the same thing. Can you touch on that?
Sure. Well, basically, as human beings evolved, we've evolved this unbelievable capacity for mental creativity and adaptability. In order to be able to do the amazing, creative and adaptable things that we do in life, we have to relegate an awful lot of what we do every day to autopilot. So the things that are on autopilot, which won't yet necessarily be on autopilot for your younger child, but if you look at the older one, you can probably see that they're becoming much more automated. Things like cleaning teeth, getting dressed, all sorts of activities are automated because that frees us up to do this amazing thinking and exploring the world. And the ways that those things become automated is partly behavioral, so that we learn action sequences, which is essentially what habits are, but also it happens on a thinking level, on a cognitive level, so that we create beliefs about ourselves and the world in our early years, in fact, our early months, but it goes on, obviously it goes on across the lifespan. But once we've developed ideas and beliefs about ourselves in the world and other people, we don't go around wondering whether they're true or not. We go around confirming what we already believe. So we select from the available evidence, from the available information in our environment, we select what we already think and believe. So we are enormously influenced in our day-to-day lives through this evolved psychology of doing what we've already done repeatedly and thinking what we already think.
So we go out every day to prove that we're right about what we think about the world.
Yeah, but we've got no idea we're doing it. So, for example, a very concrete example of that might be our political beliefs. Now, that's going a little bit, but that's just a use. So, you don't go around wondering whether the beliefs that you've evolved are right or not. You watch the news and you think that's rubbish when somebody's talking, giving a slant which isn't in line with yours. And when you listen to somebody who agrees with you, you think, marvelous, that person knows what they're talking about. So it's hugely, but we're like that about everything. So if in our early years, it's much more personal than that as well, because if in our early years and over the course of our lifespan, we have come to believe that other people are pretty benign and well-meaning, we approach other people with an expectation that they will be. So we'll be approaching them with openness, a degree of trust, a degree of curiosity, in contrast to somebody whose early experiences might have been much more characterized by disappointment or by pain or hurt, in which case somebody with those early experiences is much more likely to approach the world in a much more, maybe a bit more fearful, less trusting way, and that will absolutely affect their everything about how they interact with a new person they haven't met before.
Absolutely. And so how does that relate to food and eating?
Right. It's a bit of it relates to food. I mean, the behavioral stuff is about the eating habits, which we've already touched on. But with food, it is so interesting, this stuff. It's basically that if we believe, what we believe about ourselves will influence our ability to stick to a diet or a new way of doing things, will influence whether we are actually able to achieve our goals. So there's a really famous quote attributed to Henry Ford, which you might know, which is, whether you believe you can do something or you can't, you're probably right. In other words, your expectation and your beliefs about your capacity to do something directly influence the likelihood that you will achieve it, that you will do it. And that applies to losing weight just as much as it applies to anything else. So if your fundamental beliefs about yourself include either, I don't have the, I'm not competent enough to do this, or I don't deserve to do this, or interestingly, I won't be me, I won't feel like me if I do this, which is another big one. Those things they won't necessarily create trouble to start with, but it's only a matter of time before what you already believe about yourself and what seems to be happening is now at odds with each other. You've got what's called cognitive dissonance. You've got I'm a failure on the one hand, and I seem to be succeeding at losing weight on the other. That is our brains don't like that. Yeah. What your brain does with that is it does one of two things. It either has to allow the old belief to be questioned, challenged, or let go of, or if it can't do that, and if it holds on to that, you'll find yourself scuppering your best intentions. It will be it's too much at odds with your perception of yourself. So there are loads of ways that these expectations feed into our experience of trying to change how we eat.
I would love to talk to you for like another hour about that, but I can just ask one more question about that. So what can people do to change that belief? Because that is, I mean, in our experience, that's the thing as well. A lot of people don't think they're worthy of actually doing that. They don't deserve the body they want or to be healthy.
If it's about feeling not worthy, I think that that's a self-esteem related thing, I'd say. And with self-esteem, basically with any part of this, really, I think it's small steps are helpful. So if you can allow yourself the possibility that your existing belief about yourself may no longer be true. It may never have been true. It may never have been true in the first place that you were a failure or that you were undeserving or whatever it was. But even if you can't quite go that far, if you think to yourself, actually, maybe this isn't entirely true in all aspects of my life, in all ways. Maybe there are things, if I look around the rest of my life, maybe there are things that I've succeeded at or that prove that I am worthy of achieving success. And then gradually chip away at that belief. So gradually just allow yourself to be surprised and slightly uncomfortable that this seems to be working, and just go with it.
I like that, surprised and slightly uncomfortable.
Yeah. It's a good state to be in when you're making changes. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah. I really like that.
Yeah.
So Helen, I know that you're a very busy woman, and before you go, I wanted to share your work with everyone. So I'm going to, so I want to actually, I'm just checking time. I'm going to can you give us just 2 minutes on what this picture is of all of these books?
Yeah. So, in fact, if I took that picture again now, it would be twice as high. This was a picture that I took for a very early blog post that I wrote. And it was just the books that I had at that point bought and read. There were other things that I'd read from the library, but this was just the collection of books that I had to do with what was out there about eating differently. Now, it is not the case that these books don't work. I mean, there's some really, really serious writers in these lists, but the key thing is how many there are of them, and how things are still getting worse. We're still not. None of these offers a magic fix. Some of them work for, but it's just an indication. I might retake this photo actually and put it on my website of how many books I've now read.
That's great.
Because I was thinking somebody else must have done this. Somebody else must have done this. They hadn't. They'd done similar things, but they hadn't done quite the same.
Yeah. I mean, my co-author on my first book, Tim Noakes, he read something like 70 books when he was writing the essay at the back of Real Meal, and then about a year later, I went into his office, and he has like a wall of diet books. It's crazy. It's more than 200 books, and he says it's like, exactly what you said. They all work to an extent, but it's like a magic pill.
Yes.
And then this is the pendulum that you were talking about when you said hunger.
Yeah.
And I always eat to uncomfortably full.
Right. Well, this is as I developed the approach, what I realized was that amongst those books, that pile of books, a few of them have in there an idea of measuring hunger and fullness. So I was trying to follow what people were suggesting, but every other single way of thinking about hunger and fullness on a scale starts with 0 and goes up to 10, where 0 is very, very hungry, 10 is very, very full. Now, to me, 0 is neutral. It's nothing. Very, very, very hungry is not neutral. It's intense. It's unpleasant. It's aversive. So it just did make no sense to me at all that 0 was starving, 5 was neutral, and 10 was really full. And I realized that actually a much better for me way of summarizing things numerically was to think of a neutral point, neither hungry or full, as 0, and increasing levels of fullness are the plus numbers, and increasing levels of hunger are the minus numbers. And it's just, people seem to love it because it's intuitive. It's as simple as there's nothing magical about 11-point scale, -5 to +5. It's just seemed to be the one that was not overly fine-grained, but gave enough of a distinction.
What I loved about this the first time, and by the way, our psychologist, Victoria, she has a presentation that she gave, well, she runs lots of stuff with us, and she gave us a presentation. She actually had this picture in one of her slides.
Did she?
And I saw it, and I thought I was blown away, because it was the first time I was ever able to like identify or almost quantify my hunger. And I was like, oh my goodness, I never go below neutral, and I always eat to full. And it gave me a scale to be like, to recognize, actually, dude, you eat way too much. So I love this. It's
thank you. Well, it's proved really helpful. I called it the Appetite Pendulum, and it's on the website. It's on my Appetite Doctor website, so you can print it off very easily if you want to put it on your fridge, or put it on, or look at it on your phone.
That's great. And then we've got like 3 minutes left, so you please tell us about the book.
The book is a self-help book. It talks you through exactly how to retrain your appetite, with the starting point being understanding a little bit of biology, and then look at your life. You can skip that bit if you're not interested, but look at your lifestyle and start there. And then one habit change at a time, you can adjust how you eat to eat more in tune with those natural hunger and fullness signals. And the payoffs are just amazing, because it's habit-based, it's easy to keep the weight off. And because it encourages you to get hungry by each meal, you'll get far more pleasure, I would suggest, from eating than you ever did if you weren't hungry before. That's certainly true of me. It's true. Hundreds and hundreds of people have said similar things to me now, that they just can't believe how much pleasure you get from those first few mouthfuls when you're eating, when you're hungry. And it does mention all of the 4 types of saboteurs, and very briefly, how to overcome them.
That's great. And then finally, you offer training. So there are dietitians and other psychologists and medical professionals who will watch this and who are watching now.
Yeah.
And you do offer certification or training workshops?
Not certificate. Yeah, no, I run training workshops. I've got workshops that are effectively 2 days long, which are basically about the psychology of weight loss. They're very based on clinical skills, very simple things that professionals of any background can use to help their clients change how they eat. So I've got one of those coming up later in September, and then the next one after that is in February. But I've also got coming up a masterclass on cravings. So very specifically, it's 2 mornings, it's 2 half days, and it will teach you a basic theoretical understanding of cravings from a psychological point of view, and give you evidence-based techniques to help your clients overcome those cravings and really reduce them.
That's great. So I'll stick the links for anyone who's watching. I'll put the links in the post.
Thank you.
So that you can follow up, and I'll pop your email into the post as well. Helen,
thanks, Jonno.
It's been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much.
It's great. No, I really loved it. Thank you.
Awesome. Cool. We'll have a wonderful afternoon, and stay on the line. I'll just chat quickly. Okay. Bye, everyone.